Hello. So I'm Patty. Xʷməthkվəy is what my father told me. We're Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, registered legally with Tsleil-Waututh First Nation in northwestern Ontario. I have my race card, as my son calls it, in my bag all the time. Sometimes it gets me cheap gas, and we do pay taxes. I was raised by my mother, who's German-Ukrainian. Her family came as refugees after first they fled Stalin and wound up in American-occupied Germany, where they lived in a refugee camp, and we almost wound up in Paraguay. So then I guess I would be Latin German. But yeah, so Canada accepted them, and that's how they wound up here, along with a lot of other German Ukrainian people who sought safety in that time. And the Sgsmåk scarf that I have on my skirt, show you, ta-da! That's my Palestinian solidarity skirt. And I included the Sgsmåk scarf, which is something that we actually got from, we call them the Sgsmåk scarves because Sgsmåk means grandma. Because all those little Sgsmåks and babushkas, we got them from relationship with not just Ukrainian women, but Polish women, Belarusian women, Russian women, like all of those different communities, who came here following the Russian Revolution in 1917 and in the years leading up to that. And so for me, the skirt is a statement of solidarity. And then on the back, I have an African print making up the red triangle, which actually I got from a friend of mine, Carrie Goring. She was my co-host for 5 years on the Medicine for the Resistance podcast, which was where I learned how entwined our histories are, right? I mean, that's actually how I got talking with Angela. I found her on Twitter, and she sounded really interesting, so that we had her on the podcast. And then we had her back. And I think you've been there 4 times. Yes, so probably our most frequent guest. But you'll understand why very shortly. So yes, I have a background. I'm actually on my 4th life, I think. So I worked as a secretary. Then I called myself a kept woman. I was a stay-at-home mom for 12 years. I told people I was a kept woman. And then I became a social worker, and now I'm a writer. I became a writer because I got mad. Writing was a way of processing things for me, and I was really angry. I was still going to church at that time, and there was a sermon about how we're all the same in Jesus. And it opened by taking shots at trans people, because Billie Jean King had just gotten in a lot of trouble for talking about saying that trans people should not compete in their lived gender. And actually there was a wrestler or a trans athlete who was forced to compete with the girls. But he won, and so now they're mad that he won. Wow. And it was like make a decision, people. But bigot's gonna bigot. So so that's what this, and I just got really mad, and I kept getting more and more angry throughout this whole sermon. And then I went home and I can I say that? I posted on Facebook all afternoon about trans athletes, and that did not make me feel any better. It's really weird how posting on social like that just didn't make me feel better. So I wrote an article about feeling erased as an Indigenous person by the church, that the church found home in this place in a way that made Indigenous people homeless. It displaced us. Land back. If churches are serious, and I'm going to say this tomorrow to the Pacific Mountain Region United Church AGM where I'm speaking, this is why I'm here in Vancouver, if the churches all gave back the land, that would be a lot. Churches are pretty big landowners. So they did that, and it displaced us. And so I wrote this article, and Sojourners magazine published it. It's a lefty Christian magazine. And an editor from Broadleaf Publishers contacted me on Twitter and asked if I had ever thought of writing a book. And after confirming that she was legitimate and not some scam press, I was going to be out $5,000 and have a book nobody wanted to read. No shade to self-publishing. Self-publishing is legit, and a lot of work, and God bless anybody who can do that, because all that, the marketing and all of that is a lot of work. But I was concerned that this was a scam press. That's not what this was, and it wasn't. She's legit. My friend said, no, she's legit. So I messaged her back saying, I am now. And so it's funny, you know, like, so now I'm on my 4th life. I got 20 years before I'm going to be 80, so I got time for at least 2 more lives, I think. I'm so excited to find out what comes next. But yeah, so that's a little bit about who I am. I'm also married, 3 adult children. I have a little grandson named Charlie, who's being raised to speak his language. His parents speak to him in xʷməthkʷəy, and he's 2.5 now, and his xʷməthkվəy is better than his English, which is kind of cool. We were just in Pittsburgh for something that Ben and I had done together. And so so Grandma's there, right? So I'm babysitting each night while Mom and Dad go out and have fun in Pittsburgh, and I had fun with Charlie. And he had these books that he, you know, brought all these books to read, and he handed me one to read to him, and it was in xʷməthkվəy. Like, there was no English, it was all xʷməthkվəy. And I thought, okay, this is phonetic, I can pronounce this. It's just phonetic, I can sound it out, because it's just phonetic. And there were a few times he'd look at me. And I'd have me stumble and be like, I'm sorry, buddy, I'm doing my best. But halfway through, he'd like, put it aside. Try this one, Grandma. It was pretty funny. So yeah, so that's kind of who I am. And those are the things. Like, I'm not a historian, I'm not a theologian. But it turns out that being a social worker for 16 years trains you to assess history, to look for other sources of information, and then you write a service plan, which is basically what Becoming Kin is. It's a history review followed by a service plan. So yeah, my next book will not be, my next book's going to be more fun.
Well, who can top that?
Well, it'll be more fun. Becoming Kin is kind of a bummer. It's a good book, but it's kind of a bummer.
It's a good book, and actually she's reading from my copy of it that's all written up and stuff. That you're not, that I was told you're not supposed to do the books, but she gave me permission.
I write in my books all the time.
I'm Angela J. Gray. I am a mother, a daughter, a twin, a friend, a colleague. I love to write, and I love to paint, and I love to sing, and I love to dance with my friends when I'm drunk. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that, but I love to do that. I am many things, and I think that what brings me here today, what brings me in this space is a story. I'm a storyteller. I'm a poet, and a story that's important to me. And it's about adoption. It's about transracial adoption. And it's about history that's not talked about. And I think that my goal is to reevaluate who gets to tell stories about history, whose voice gets to heard about history, and in particular in adoption, because quite often it's the adoptee's story that doesn't get told. And in transracial adoption, there's many narratives around it, and many narratives around what is good and good intention. And I have had the privilege of working really hard in isolation, and in the last few years having really great support. Naomi, Rachel, cohort, Jill here, beautiful friends and colleagues listening to my story. And so why am I here? To talk about it. And so thank you for all showing up. I think, you know, I did write my bio, and I didn't talk anything about that bio, so, but I hope that that gives you enough insight into, I could talk about where a few things were published, I could talk about those things, but I think what I'd like to talk about with Patty is around adoption. So what, we didn't have a set framework. I kind of created it on the way here on the bus. This is how I do, this is how I work. But I'm going to share a bit of my memoir. I have the privilege of almost being done one. Rachel Rose is going to get a knock on her door soon. It's done. I'm about 2 weeks away. I've been dedicated over the last several weeks spending time. And this is one of the chapters. It's called Birth Registration. It's a bit long. Patty's going to help me out here.
It's like performance art.
It's a little bit. It's a little bit. So buckle in, take care of yourselves, and love to. Patty's going to read a bit from her book after this little bit of reading, and then we want to open it up to have a bit of a discussion, questions, comments, all that she can give to. Birth registration number. They appeared beside my birth mother's hospital bed, wearing a blue skirt, white blouse, and blue sensible heels. It was carrying a black purse, clipboard, and pen. My mother was not established. She was a non-landed immigrant who came to the emergency room in premature labor. She was sick and carrying fear as deep as near death itself as she laid in the ICU. She needed and asked for help. There, dear. We are here to help, they said. And she was helped right out of caring for her children and hearing nothing about them for 3 decades. I was younger then, carrying a toddler around on my hip. I had long since left the community where I grew up, not knowing my mother had been a 2-hour drive away. When she learned I had been raised by white parents, we both wept. She stayed in the community where we were born, hoping, praying my twin and I would reappear in her life. We cried a lot together that day in February when we first spoke about why I was not with her. I wonder about how difficult it must have been lying sick while a plan was being formulated about what was going to happen to her twins.
Rename children, change birth date, place in foster care.
My mother carried a vulnerable naivety. She thought Canada was all that and it would support her. She was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after my birth and began her attempts to keep us. The social worker gave her locations and places to go in a city larger than the Jamaican countryside where her family farm was, where avocado pears grew that she loved so much to eat. While my mother was running, they were executing their mental checklist of caring. What is best for the children? It was discussed and contemplated. It was best to move these children from the irresponsible and immature Black mother so that she does not harm them. My mother did not know a character assassination would determine her children's fate. I never told her what they wrote about her in the reports.
Burn birth records. Write disparaging notes in the file about birth mother, father, culture. Advertise children in local national newspapers.
Sometimes then, days and weeks after my mother and I were communicating, I would lie listless on my futon couch, my boy beside me, thinking about desperation, thinking about her pleading to take her twins to her family in Jamaica, thinking about what it must have felt like to be told no. I read the information given to me about the circumstances of my adoption and see no words about this ask and decline. My twin and I were taken from the hospital a month after our birth, and we were placed in foster care. Our stay in foster care was to be temporary, only until my mother put something in place for herself. The community agency where she was sent told her they could not help her get landed status. She was supporting herself as a domestic worker. With little money, she attempted to navigate the city and an unfamiliar child welfare system bereft of compassion. How does a mother with little means show up? Do what she's told to keep her children. Find someone to advocate on her behalf. Find
loving home outside of community where child was born. place black children up for adoption without birth parents' consent. Rename children for the second time.
The social worker painted a picture of my mother that lived on paper, in a file, housed in a box. A story carefully crafted. A story I was told before my adoption information was released to me. Your mother only showed up to see you and your twin once. My mother came to the foster care 3 times. The dates she has recorded in a black book that is kept hidden underneath linen in the top drawer of her dresser. The 4th time she came, she was told we were gone. The agency told me how much they wanted to help my mother, but she just didn't comply. Eventually, they just lost track of her. They had no choice, they said. There was a long pause after I asked about my birth records. The hospital had a fire in the records room. All the files from that time were destroyed, they said. Oh, I see, I said. The hospital never returns my calls. I have stopped calling. There are no records to confirm either the Children's Aid Society or Dorothy's claims. I can find no newspaper articles that says this fire actually happened.
Find parents who will place child's name on family's family tree. Find parents who will provide bed, food, education. Find parents who will not allow black child to excel beyond her place.
There are days, I imagine, blowing up the Children's Aid Society. I imagine setting fire to the collective history of the Social Planning Council of Metropolitan Toronto, who made it their mission to get black kids out of foster care. There are days I want to rip up Helen Allen and her Today's Child articles in more pieces than the world can fucking count.
Find parents who will instill propaganda that chosen means loved. Find parents who ensure a conservative Christian upbringing will ensue. Find parents who ensure black child minds the police who protect them.
While mine and my twins' pictures from our foster care stay were being placed in a photo album of our new parents, my mother was languishing at night in her bed in the house where she worked. Her children were gone. Her pictures were the ones in her mind, left there from the last day she saw us. My mother doesn't know that my twin and I were brought into our adopted family on Canada Day. I don't put up a flag on Canada Day. This quiet rebellion is an ode to her. People have told me, well-meaning people have said, surely your mother knew the paper she signed. Your mother must have consented, Angela. There are laws in place for these things. That is what they will continue to say before I tell them that I would like to rip their tongues out of their mouths. I wonder why it's so hard to believe that social workers can lie. They can lie. I was raised by one.
Ensuring all points of this checklist are marked will result in an integrated, compliant child.
I had cake on my birthdays. Presents were left under the tree for me at Christmas. I always found a white chocolate bunny, my favorite, at Easter. I swam at the local pool in the summer, skated at the various ice rinks in the winter, and twirled, rolled, and leapt on bars and mats at the local gym. It appeared that they had done their job. The isolation from anyone close to my heritage, though, created a divide inside me. I felt alone because I was black and wanted to feel a part of something. So I pretended to be white so I felt like I could be. They chose the right folks to assimilate me. I longed for the ghost mother that surrounded me. The loss and grief that became a sweater that never left my mother's body is the desperation that still sits with her that continues to keep us apart. Dorothy and I have not spoken in a long time now. We love each other. I know this. We have since she carried me in the wound. The harm of unresolved grief separates us, mine and hers. I try to find answers, and she tries to forget. What she remembers still the most is the burst spot on the base of my baby right toe. The project was well intended, they say. We don't talk enough about the impact of good intentions.
I'll say, as a social worker who had a former, I should say, social worker, reading that checklist hit. Reading that checklist hit because, I mean, we had different checklists and we didn't phrase things exactly that way, but those were definitely the things that we looked for and the things that, I mean, I tell one of the story that's not the part that I'm going to read from, but in my book I tell, because I talk about my years in child welfare. And child welfare is what made me an abolitionist. I'm an abolitionist. All carceral systems need to be abolished. And child welfare is a carceral system. Our current healthcare system, our mental health system is, I would also argue, a carceral system.
A what system?
The mental health, carceral, so police-oriented.
Oh, okay.
And, confining people. And I would also argue that mandated reporting makes us all complicit in carceral systems. When you have to report to police and you have to report to child welfare. Trust the professionals. But I tell us, one of the stories that I tell in Becoming Kin up from my time in child welfare is about a pair of siblings that I was working with as a child welfare worker because, or as a child, like a child and care worker, sorry, because I wanted to know what happened to these kids when they left care. Or when they got taken into care, because at the time I was doing, investigations, which my job was to find out if the thing happened, right? So we'd get a report, and then my job was to go out and talk to everybody involved, assess history, and try to find out if the thing happened. And if the thing did in fact happen, what are we going to do about it? And so sometimes what we did about it was we removed the children, and then as the intake worker, I kind of lost track, because my focus is on the parents. Right? And so a child and care worker is now focused on the child. And so I thought, well, I'll do a year, because maternity leaves, right? So I'll do a year and kind of see what this experience is like for these kids. And so I tell the story about these two siblings. It's fairly well scrubbed. There's actually 4 siblings involved, but I only talk about 2 of them. But there were actually 4 siblings involved with this family. And so much of what you wrote about comes up in that story, comes up in what I'm talking about, because these families, they were Haitian refugees. They had refugeed first to the US, and then the US was returning them to Haiti. And Haiti, at the time, was still fairly dangerous. It wasn't that long after the earthquake, or, that it happened. Earthquake or hurricane? Was there an earthquake in Haiti?
Earthquake, yeah.
There was an earthquake. Okay, yeah, I thought for a minute my brains weren't working. I'm gonna plead time difference. I'm from Niagara Falls. But anyway, but Canada wasn't returning them yet. So Canada would give them refugee status, but we weren't deporting them either. So it was kind of this weird little stateless limbo that people were in. But these parents, they could not access any meaningful mental health care. They were frequently homeless. There was domestic violence. There was certainly physical abuse. But with that whole package put together, it would be, like, of course these are traumatized parents who hadn't lived in a stable place for probably 10 years. Often sleeping in subway, like in the Montreal metro, right? The subway system. So unable to access meaningful health care, not speaking the language. They spoke Creole, which is not the same as French. We brought in a French interpreter for another family, and the kids they understood English better than they understood this French interpreter, because Creole is not the same language as French, and Creole just depends also on where you are. Language struggles, unable to find housing, lots of trauma that they weren't able to get any meaningful support for. We took their children from them for reasons that made sense. I mean, these kids were not stable, but we did not, we saved children, not families. Why do we not argue to get these parents into stable housing? Because it doesn't exist, right? You know, so we rescue kids but not family, obviously white foster homes, because that's mostly who gets through the process. And an opportunity for them to become adopted came up by a family who was actually from Haiti. The one, I think it was the mom was from Jamaica and the dad was from Haiti. They went home to Haiti every year to visit his family. So these kids would grow up, had a shot at growing up in a family, you know, going from a white foster home into a family that looked like them, that spoke Creole, that, you know, would take them home, not to the tourist destinations of Haiti, but the communities of Haiti. And it felt like and I worked hard, because this kid was really attached to his foster mom now and did not want to leave her. And I tricked him into, like, it was really, I worked on Saturdays. I wanted this to work, and they seemed like lovely people. But I had to work really hard to make that happen. And the parents, for years, would still call the supervisor to find out what happened to their kids, because they did not consent to anything. The court order was made in their absence, because they didn't understand the language.
But the thing is...
And they were hard to find. And the system is not set up to be generous towards people who are struggling.
And the rules, though, and the laws that you were embedded in Ontario were based on the Child Welfare Act of 1965, which in fact was made, the laws at that time were made really easy for adoptions to go through. Really quickly.
For sure.
And to the point where they were looking at, even from the States, they were coming up and interviewing. In particular, I was a part of a social experiment. I don't talk about it now, but it was a social experiment that was happening in the 60s.
Of which I'm just going to interject to say the 60s scoop, and when we talk about Native kids being scoop, was part of that.
Yes.
And that's a part of things that we don't often talk about, which is why this conversation is really important.
Yeah.
Because we do talk about the 60s scoop with Indigenous kids, but we don't recognize that that experiment included other children as well.
And so they would adapt them to the region, right? So the Toronto Social Planning Committee, with the Children's Aid Society, with the Catholic Children's Aid Society, with the Jewish community and other community members, put this project together by the then minister to get Black kids out of foster care. But the question is, we're not asking why those kids were in foster care, right? We're not asking about the supports. We're not asking about the fact that, in my circumstance, my mother gave birth to us premature. And so she wasn't expecting twins, and she wasn't expecting to give us prematurely, and she was not expecting to get ill. That put her in the hospital for 3 weeks. That allowed and set these things in motion. And then they set it off and said, well, you need to go here, here, and here. But how do you do that if you can't navigate the city? You don't know what the Welfare Act is, and you don't have any money, right? And so, and because she was non-managed, she had no access to the things that you're talking about. And so it is important to take these things and apply the lens to what's happening today. You know, I can't change what happened to my brother and I. I can say that there's long-term impacts. I can say when you have a social experiment, like nobody came to our house and checked up on us. We were part of an experiment. How do you know what it's going to be like in 20 years? Nobody's ever asked. I can tell you in a book, but nobody's ever asked, right?
Well, and what message does it send to kids, right? That their Black, Indigenous, South Asian, Mexican family is not safe, but this shiny white family is safe. And I'll tell you, the supports that foster parents get go far beyond the per diem. Like, right, they get clothing allowance, they get a worker who will come with like no stigma attached because it's the child care worker, you know, for the child and care worker, to show up at school meetings for you. Oh, you're working full time and you don't have time to go to the school meeting? That's okay, the worker will go for you and we'll pass on the information. You don't have time to take little Billy to the doctor because you're working full time? That's okay, the worker will take little Billy to the doctor. You know, because they get daycare, they get benefits. Like, could you imagine a world where parents got stable housing, and where all housing was affordable, not just affordable housing, but all housing was affordable, access to meaningful medical care, access to meaningful mental health care, access to affordable child care, a universal basic income so that you could stay home if you needed to. Like all these things that foster parents get, like what if everybody got them, like what kind of world would that be? That would be a great world. Like, why don't we all have, like, we say it takes a village, but foster parents are the only ones who get it.
And, but there's a curious question that Carmen and I, we've talked about it. What is the, Carmen's my work daughter. What is the incentive for adoption? Like, in this project,
if you adopt siblings, you get bonus money, by the way, in Ontario, to keep siblings together.
And
you get a cash bonus. Is that not messed up?
But
that's messed up.
So the twins, my parents got a cash bonus for these twins. I can't see how, just knowing my parents, I just can't see how money wasn't involved in some way. Like, I just can't.
Yeah, well, there's like signs, there's like notices that talk about getting paid to take Native kids. That you get paid, that you got like, I think it was like $10 at the time, which, I guess, and that was in the earlier 1900s. This movement, now just to kind of speak more broadly, this strategy of moving children, and this is where I have the book, I recommended the book, The History of White People. Nell Irvin Painter, she's a Black historian, and she says, like, no, everybody studies us and writes about us and what's wrong with us and how we got messed up, and the same like Native people, everybody's studying us and writing about us. She says, how come nobody's writing about white people? Like, we should be studying white people because, like, how did things get this way? Gotta study white people. So it's the history of white people. It's actually a fascinating book because she gets into things like white slavery. The fact that the word slave comes from Slavic people, that's where the word actually comes from. So she talks about that. She talks about, but there's this really interesting chapter where she talks about the development of social work. Because part of the problem was that despite being the master race, some white people weren't amounting to much. They weren't succeeding in ways. They were acting like people or Native people, like something's wrong. And so clearly that had to be a genetic problem. And that's where the intelligence testing comes from. That's where, you remember the IQ scale, which is why we don't use the R word, and even idiot is part of that as well. It's part of that whole scale. In terms that's where that stuff was developed, to come up with a medical reason for why, despite being the master race, some white people weren't amounting to very much. And so social work actually developed as a way of rescuing white people and rescuing their children. That's where child welfare comes from. It doesn't come from the Humane Society. That's kind of the popular myth. It actually comes from middle-class white ladies rescuing the children of questionable white people. And it could be political, it could be perceived intellectual, it could be like all kinds of reasons. If you're going to take these children, and that was the social experiment of that time, we're going to take these children from their defective parents, they're actually called defectives at that time, and put them in like a good home and see if that, the nature or nurture thing, right? See if we can overcome their limitations by putting them with a good family. And so then so this movement of children from one social group to another social group to create good citizens was the goal, of this, has a very long history. And actually, you could go back like all through history. The movement of children from the conquered people to the conquering people has a very long history. It's, good social strategy, if you want to assimilate a community, you want to move their children and have them raised differently. So then, so after World War II, so the Native people are all in residential schools, the Black families, nobody's really paying a lot of attention to them at this point. But then World War II happens and everybody sees the concentration camps. And Hitler thought that reservations in residential schools were great. There's like an editorial from 1939 where he wrote, wow, Americans, like, you guys really aced this. Different language, but that's basically what he said. And it's in there, like Laura Landertanger wrote a master's thesis about Native children in foster care because she wanted to know why it was so disproportionate. And she found out that in their own records, they're writing things like, wow, our residential schools look like concentration camps, like we can't do this anymore. Not because the residential schools were bad, But because everybody was looking at concentration camps, and Canada's very concerned with its image, right? Canada's very concerned with its image as being not like Americans. You know, Canada's the good guys, they're not like the Americans. So that's where you see kind of the decline of the residential schools and the rise so the kids didn't go home. They just, instead of going into residential schools, they went into foster homes. And the language is exactly the same. The warrant to remove a child and put them in a residential school and the warrant to remove a child and put them in their home is all about safety.
Yes.
And that's where, so the 60s, so Native kids get scooped, Black kids get scooped, you know, and it's continuing today, right? In the US border, at the south, those kids in cages are going into white foster homes because everybody raised a big stink about how kids shouldn't be in cages, and so they went out of the cages and into white foster homes. And part of the problem with the legislation, I mean, a lot of problems with them, which shouldn't be removing children, period. But one of the problems with the legislation is that children deserve permanence, right? Yes. They deserve forever families.
Yes.
And so you've got a timeline. If the child is under the age of 2, if their parents basically need to get their stuff together, get their kids back within a year. Over 2, parents have 2 years. So when you're talking in the US about, you know, the kids in cages at the border and people with unstable migratory status, does that make sense? But you know, kind of immigration status like your mom had, that makes it really impossible to meet these criteria within the time frame set by the government, at which point the court will decide, possibly in the parent's absence, to give this child permanence. And that's what's happened to a lot of kids at the border, and now we're seeing similar organizations get really ramped up for rescuing Palestinian children. And this is always about rescuing children. It's got nothing to do with families, and it's actually got nothing to do with anybody's safety. It's all about creating, because what's the big problem we're going to have in 20 years with the Palestinian children? They're going to be pretty fucking bad, right?
Yeah,
they're going to be really mad, so we better short circuit that by getting them into white families and going through that checklist that I read and making sure that they get properly assimilated. Somebody was saying to me today, we were talking about this, and said that adoption is the only trauma for which the victim is expected to be grateful.
It is, and there's a line in my book where I'm very clear, I'm not grateful. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that there wasn't good things that happened. What we're thinking about is what the long-term impact is. Mm-hmm. And what we're also thinking about, and what you talked about, is propaganda. Mm-hmm. So there's a propaganda to make adoption palatable. Mm-hmm. So let's change the language, you were chosen. Every child deserves to be loved. This is the premise of the Toronto Social Planning Committee's social experiment. So what it was called in the time is the adoption of Negro children, a community approach. And so it was looking at, you know, post-war, early, like starting in 1954, you can see the beginnings of Black kids going into foster care in Canada, in particular in the Toronto region.
What was going on in the 1950s?
Civil rights.
That's right.
Yeah. So
stop that.
So so you have all that propaganda. You have, you know, every child deserves to be loved. Black is beautiful. All those things that was happening at that time. And what actually happened and what the long-term impact is isolation from culture. Because it doesn't matter how much you want to try to assimilate anybody, what you're doing is disconnecting that person from themselves. When you don't have people, culture that's like you, because you can't walk into a space without anybody thinking of, like, you look at me and you can't tell that I'm adopted. Like, nobody would know that. Like, but that is a huge part of who I am. So what's missing is my culture, is my ancestry. That's what would ground me and land with me. We're gonna segue into Patty reading a bit about that, but it's really, these are the things we want to consider moving forward. What is the value of ancestry? What is the value of community connection? where is the money coming from to support children? And what can we do to change the adoption process? I'm on the fence about adoption, I really am. Some days I'm thinking it's okay, and I remember one of my siblings that wasn't adopted saying to me that they were always asked when my parents adopted 4 black kids and had 3 children that were older, and they were always asked if to bring these kids in. And I think about that. I think about being 6 and 7 and 10 and asked if I want another brother or sister. And I think, well, you know, that might be a little bit cool to have that little doll friend, but maybe not, right?
I think what's wrong with adoption is the nuclear family. Because the Anishinaabe have, like most cultures, have a tradition of adoption. Like, one of the things that was part of Anishinaabe community was if you had a lot of kids and there was a couple that couldn't have kids, you gave them one of your kids. Of course you did. If there was a two-spirited couple in your community, you would give them one of your kids. They were still your kid, they were still part of your community, you still saw them. If you were having a hard time, you would send, but the child was still part of your community. Right? They were still part of your community, they knew who you were. You were still part of that village raising that child. So it wasn't, and I think we need a world where, you know, kind of like, you know, when we talk about abolition, and it's like, no, we don't want to just like end policing and empty the prisons and not change anything else about our society. Yes, we want to end policing and empty the prisons, but also have a society where those things aren't even necessary. Where we have access to the things that we need. And I think we can think the same way about adoption. If we build our communities differently, then parents who are dealing with too much trauma to be able to parent their children safely could have a safe place to be and safe people to be with to take off some of that pressure that they're struggling with, or they've got health issues, or whatever precarity, because we're in, I don't know, if y'all haven't listened to Astra Taylor's Massy lectures, it's not like the Massy books, it's like Massy with an E. I mainlined her Massy lectures. I was driving to Boston for a thing a couple of months ago, and I just listened to them like one after another all the way there. They were so good. But she talks about manufactured precarity and the way we are inherently precarious as people. And that can and when we're precarious in our own ways, that builds community, that builds interdependence and relationship. But when we're made precarious, or when that precarity is exploited the way it is in our society, then that just keeps things very unstable. So yeah, so that's my thing about adoption. It's not that adoption itself is bad, it's the society that it operates within that's bad. Okay, so this is from my book. This is actually from my favorite chapter. I reconnected with my father when I was in my late 20s. And shortly after that, he took me home to Tsleil-Waututh. It was the first time I had been home since leaving as a toddler, and I did not know what to expect. Going home is fraught with hopes and unrealistic expectations, and I had plenty of both, and a lot of hours to ruminate on them. It's a long drive from Niagara Falls to Tsleil-Waututh. People don't often realize how massive the province of Ontario is. You could start in Ontario, drive for 24 hours, and still be in Ontario. The geography changes, and although the highway goes up and down as it travels around Lake Superior, you're mostly going up into the Canadian Shield. There are long stretches empty of people, towns that you blink and miss, and then we were there, but not really there. When I went home for the first time, there was no road into the reserve, so we stayed at a cabin nearby. My father pointed out the lake, across the lake to Frenchman's Head, and told me that's where the reserve is. Although there is a road now, in the mid-1990s, the people who lived there got in and out of the community by boat. There are still many reserves scattered across northern Canada that are accessible only by boat or plane, or ice roads in the winter. My father took me to Umphreeville, a nearby community that had grown up around a lumber mill. That town is one of the ones where my mother had taught. and it is where my father and his family lived. Nobody had lived there for years when we visited it. There were fields of tall grass with a few wooden structures. He pointed at various buildings, telling me what they used to be. Some cousins happened to be in Umfreyville that day. I don't remember why they were there. Perhaps they were berry picking because there are a lot of blueberry bushes in northern Ontario. I took out the photo album I had brought with me. It held photographs of me as a baby, pictures of my father and uncles, my grandmother, other children. They looked at the pictures and remembered stories, talked about who was still alive and who wasn't, remembering what they used to be. On that visit, I met my grandmother, living by then in Sioux Lookout. It was a bittersweet meeting. All those moments were fraught with hope and unrealistic expectations, because like Umfreyville itself, we are not what we used to be. Our lives have moved in different directions, and our shared memories stop at the same place as the photographs that recorded them. There were people who remembered me, people who remembered stories about me, and in the intervening years, they had periodically wondered what had happened to me. This was not a surprise. I had also leafed through the photo album and wondered what had happened to them. What was a surprise was the undeniable sensation that the land and water remembered me too. I stood beneath stands of black spruce and looked across the lake, and it felt so familiar that it ached. I went down to the rocky beach and put my hands in the water, and it remembered me. I cannot tell you how or why I knew that. It was completely unexpected, that sensation of both remembering and being remembered. I can only describe it as electric. Since that time, I have had other fleeting reminders that the land is alive in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I told you earlier that I had stopped collecting stones, and that is mostly true. But this past summer, when I went home again, we camped at provincial parks around Lake Superior. And at one of them, my husband brought me a stone he had picked up on a beach covered in round stones. When I held it in my hand, it felt like mine. Not mine like a thing that was now in my possession, but mine like my children are mine, like my parents are mine. We belong to each other. Now, I'm going to skip a paragraph and I'll finish with this one. Thinking about my experience of going home, I wonder about those who can't return to the lands that would remember them. Migrants like my maternal family, who in fleeing violence are forever cut off from the land that knew them by the oppressive politics of those who hold power. Those of the Black diaspora, people forcibly displanted again and again, who may not even know which land held their ancestors. But the land is alive. And perhaps the lands that exist in the place we call Africa carried stories of ancestors to its western shores. Maybe the stories traveled on mycelium networks that stretched for miles underground. Maybe the trees whispered to each other. Maybe memories and knowledge were carried on the dust that blows from the Sahara across the Atlantic. Perhaps the sea, a primeval creature of long memory, accepted the burden of these stories and bore them on waves, gathering them along with the heartbeats and tears of those who did not complete the crossing. In this way, stories wash up on the shore of the land we call North America and are carried inland. The stories are shared in low murmurings, in the whispers of wind on trees and grassland, so that the beings who live here and listen carefully to such stories are able to offer medicine and belonging to those in diaspora. Native people will tell you, look for the medicine that shows up.
Beautiful. Thank you. So you went home. I went home. I went back to Jamaica for the first time in 2020, just before COVID hit. I was gifted, partly gifted, 12 days there. And it was an exciting and scary and incredible time. I went looking for family. I went looking to find out more about my birth mother, to find out more about my birth father. And I didn't find anything there, but I found family after, which was an interesting thing. And while I was there, I stayed in a 7 Mile, which is just outside of Kingston. And we walked along Cable Beach, and it's not a beach it's a surfing beach. It's not, you know, one of those beaches that you would see in a flyer somewhere. It was rocky and wavy, and it was actually during Black History Month. And even though Jamaica celebrates Black History, they don't celebrate Black History because their history's with them all the time, right? Which was incredible. But I walked along this Cable Beach with Yvonne, who was my home Airbnb host. And she was telling me the ways to take care of myself while I was traveling. And don't get in a cab with just men, okay? It's like, don't do that.
With a bear.
Maybe don't go to that pub at the corner there, okay? There's only men there. I said, Yvonne, I'm fine, okay? But I felt for the first time that I found myself. And I think we find ourselves in varying ways as we grow, and I think that I grew into writing this book to where it is now, because where I started I wasn't ready, but I really grew into it. And going to Jamaica really solidified that. It was the first time that I was in spaces where I saw people that looked like me every day, in every shop, in every space, driving in cars. And that was incredible. That's an incredible thing. I can tell you, I did not understand half the time what Yvonne was saying to me. I have been studying Spanish and love Spanish, and there's another Spanish connection there. But I probably should have been learning patois before I went to Jamaica. But some of the lovely things amongst the difficult things were, Angela, you need to learn how to eat a mango like a Jamaican. And I couldn't find any information about my father. I will never find any information. He was killed in a car. He was sitting in his car and he was shot. These are some of the things that happened in Jamaica. And there's some really beautiful things that happen in Jamaica. And apparently where I was staying, 15 minutes away, my uncle, one of my aunts, and one of my cousins were going to this little restaurant every day for the entire time I was there, and I had no idea. Jamaica has a lovely old-timers network, so if you want to find out information, you ask the old-timers and they'll find it out for you. So I found out, I had a driver while I was there, and he came to pick me up one morning and he says, okay, I've got information about your father. And I get in the car and he says, okay, so you have a brother who lives somewhere in California. And then he looks at me, should I take you to a spa? Do you want to go to a spa? I says, no, I don't, because we were going to Anatole Bay, which is where my father worked and lived. And I wanted to go and see, for whatever reason, I wanted to go to the government office there to see if his picture was on the wall. These are the things that go through your mind when you're trying to find people. And there was no picture of my father on the wall. They didn't need him. But I did find out some things, and I have an uncle that lives in Jamaica still, and I have a cousin that lives in Jamaica still, and I have a whole bunch of aunts and uncles and cousins that live in New Jersey and New York and Atlanta. And I found that I have a brother that lives in Brampton. And these were all the things that was difficult for my mother to tell me because of the grief of the loss. She can't share these things. I keep searching for these things. She can't share these things because she still is traumatized by us being taken. Finding ancestry, which is important, that lives alongside of sustaining grief. And that sustaining grief is something that we live with, and it may never reconcile. I don't think I'll ever reconcile it. I don't think I'll ever have the relationship with my brother that he wants to have with me. I think the grief is too deep within me. And I think that my adoption family experience is very fractured. And so that translates into whatever relationship I might have with family. And so I look to my friendships and my community for that family because that's safe for me. There's no expectation there. I can be me. with my birth family, they want the past in the past, but my past isn't in the past, it lives with me, that trauma lives with me. I'm not what I was 20 years ago, but it's still with me. And so, but what sustains me is my ancestry. What sustains me is the resiliency in my ancestry, the strength in knowing that we're strong people. So the last day that I was in Jamaica, Yvonne's husband, Tracy, asked me, so do you think you found what you were looking for here? And I think I did. And Yvonne looked at me and she said, you know, Angela, Jamaican women are strong women. And I can carry that in my days when I'm sad, because I'm still sad. I think fracturing takes a long time to repair, if ever. But what we do is we learn how to live well. And we learn how to embrace the love that's present to us in the best way that we can. And we talk about these things, we share these stories, we become storytellers. And we build connections with other communities. So it is important for me to build connection with you, not only for my son, who has Indigenous heritage, but for me. For me to learn, to grow, and to be a part of what this world is. And I don't celebrate Canada Day. I can't. I just can't. I cry on Canada Day, actually. And I cry at my birthday because I'm not with my twin. And sometimes in these well intentions of keeping folks together, we're not together. We didn't raise our kids together. He's not here tonight. And so it's important in these stories to recognize the long-term impact of that grief. It's important to talk about that.
When I was reading your pages, there was that phrase, and you read it tonight, about grief. And it made me think of grief as a being in its own right. That it had become... So I'm obsessed with the book The Actual Star by Monica Byrne. It's so good. I highly recommend it. It's fiction. It's so good. But one of the things that she taught that happens in this book is so it's these three siblings over time, right? So they're 1012 BC in the Mayan world, and then 2012 in our world, and 3012 in a future world, and it's centered on Mayan cosmology. And so it's these twins. It starts out, it's these three siblings, but these three siblings start out as twins. Like, we find out that they have lived so many lives. And so they start off as twins, and the care between them actually becomes so strong that it becomes a person. And so that's where you get the third sibling. It actually becomes a person. And so that what you'd said about grief made me think of Monica's book. Because it made me think of sometimes the grief that we hold, the grief that is between you and your mom, the grief that was between me and my father, becomes its own being. It becomes its own being in its own right. And we need to be gentle and respectful of that being. And in Indigenous cultures, we would feast it. We would treat it as a real, like I don't know that we have ceremonies for grief that becomes a real person, but we have ceremonies for dealing with, I keep forgetting these people over there, but we have ceremonies for remembering those who are no longer with us, for feasting them, for honoring them. And I wonder if, because we have that grief. I did not grow up with my native community. There is a shorthand that exists in all communities, right? People who grow up together, there's a shorthand. There's, pop culture phrases, right? But if you grew up in a marginalized community, you also have those pop culture phrases, kind of those little phrases. But if you didn't grow up in that community, you don't have those things. Yeah. You don't have that cultural shorthand. And so you will always be on the outside of that community. And you can become friends, you can reconcile relationships. I have friends, I'm deeply embedded in my local Native community. I have relatives at home that I'm always happy to go see. I have relatives in Winnipeg. I just said yes to something in Winnipeg because my cousins live there. And even though it's just going to be a Zoom thing, I feel like that's a community that I should invest time in. Because if I can help this organization do better, that will help my relatives. So I can be connected in those ways, but I'm still not connected. I'm not connected the way they're connected. And so when you talked about grief, and that's actually, I've talked with, so one of the cool things about having a podcast is if you say to somebody, hey, that's a real cool thing, you want to come on the podcast? And they say, okay. And so we talked with Chelsea Vowell, who's an Métis writer. And Chelsea talked about, she's also a language teacher. She's fluent in Cree, and so she's also a language teacher. And she says that one of the things that we don't talk about in language learning is grief. The grief of having to learn our language. And she said, this is why white people will come to our language classes and pick it up like that. Where the children and grandchildren of residential school survivors will struggle. And it's not because you have Native friends and easy, like people that you can talk to about it, and we don't. We're the ones with the people we have. But it's just, it's that grief, and so we need to have space to, and I'm going to say honor rather than process. To honor that grief, because that grief is a legitimate, real thing that maybe has become its own person. And like my father and I, that was always a barrier between us, and now he's passed, and so we're still trying to work it out, I guess, in that way. But yeah, and so now I'm thinking about grief as a tangible being. Not always, but in some of these moments, it becomes its own person.
I think that's real. I like what you talk about language, because part of my history and Jamaican history is like, I come from African, Irish, and Panamanian roots. And so my grandfather, he was raised in Panama. And for many reasons, and there's a history there, and there's a book there. Went back to Jamaica, his family went back to Jamaica, but he still longed for, up until he died, Panama. And would isolate himself in a room in their house and listen to the radio, Panamanian radio. And so for me now, for the last, and it's probably going to take me another 20 years, but for the last 8 years, when I learned about my grandfather, I've been trying to learn Spanish and to connect to that patriarchal connection of my history. And my father was from Panama as well. And so, but it's hard. And I think it's part because I want to be there with them. It's my way of being there with them in some way. And it just takes me so long. Some days I think my Spanish tutor is going to fire me. So I think that's real about learning what is your history, what is your birthright, right? Like that Panamanian culture is part of my birthright.
And how can I honor those relatives?
And
how can I honor these communities that they were from that may not necessarily be my communities anymore?
Yeah.
But they still contain story that are important pieces of who I am.
So it's that journey of, and there's a really good book about the journey of the adopted self, and it really touches on those disconnections that are really important in terms of the formation of us as beings, right? And when we have parental familial loss, it impacts that growth. It impacts that development of self, that full self, that needs to be a part of this narrative as well. That's kind of missing. Like, there are just some basic things that adoptees drop out of high school at a higher rate than other folks.
Yeah, like if we know, and it's the same with foster kids. Like the success stories are always trumpeted around, like, oh, you know, she became whatever. But those handful of success stories don't outweigh the vast majority of non-success, who don't meet the markers of what we would call successful. And so if it's as a social experiment, set up by Nell, that Nell Irvin Painter writes about in her book. We're starting with these defective white people. Was the language at the time. I'm not saying that they were defective. It's just like that was the social work language of the time. If the experiment was to move children from these so-called defectives to good, to so-called good families, to turn them into so-called good citizens, if it wasn't successful, and then it wasn't successful, why are we still doing it?
Yes.
If this is, and I would suggest that was because that is not the end game. If you keep doing the thing, and the thing is, by your own measure, a failure, but you keep doing the thing, then this measure that you have set publicly is not really why you're doing it. So, kind of like when they say, we want to be fiscally responsible, and yet all the research proves that if you give people housing and medical care and access to food, you will have safer community, you will have safer neighborhoods. That really all you need to provide is stable housing. You don't even have to provide the other stuff. If the only thing you provide is stable housing, you will have safer communities. There will be a drop in the cost of medical care because people aren't going to emergency rooms and all of that stuff. And yet they won't do that thing. So they don't care about saving money. Saving money is not the issue. Because they can afford to keep us in jail, where it costs like a lot more than you can have. If you can house people in prison, you can house people outside of prison. But maybe we should open up for questions. Does anybody have questions? Thoughts? Because we could just keep babbling.